All right. All right. So I needed to hit record just to make sure that we get this part of the conversation. So Sue, ask your question again. Sue Fish, what was your question again that you asked?
Well, I was just noticing that everything in Leviticus is said twice and it's almost identical. It's not like they say it in different words, or it's not like in Psalms where it's really poetic and it's the same thing, but it's in different words. Or the thing about that Jesus going into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and it says it twice, and everybody thought he was on a mule and a horse or something, or the Virgin Mary, and all of that.
Yeah. So do you have an example just so I can like see where you're looking at it? Like,
well, yes, they'll say it's all in Leviticus 1.
Okay.
Chapter 1 is the same as chapter 2.
Yeah, it would.
2 is similar to chapter 3.
I think.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
They say it twice. It's the same thing. It's if the burnt offering from the herd, if the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you shall offer a male without a blemish. And then it says, if your gift for a burnt offering is from the flock, it's slightly different.
So, okay, I
offering shall be a male without blemish. It says the same thing, it's just slightly different words.
So, okay, I see what you're getting at. Yes, it is this is one of the hallmarks of Leviticus. It is thorough and it is repetitive.
Okay.
And the details are normally especially at the section I had you read, just like the first few chapters of Leviticus, the new information is all at the top. So it's one of those that one of the I guess stereotype, the kind of trope of rabbis and Jewish teachers is asking very specific questions.
Okay.
Making sure there's no loopholes. And so the way that this is written is designed to kind of close off any kind of loophole you could possibly think of. And yet.
I saw that. Just in case you didn't get it, we'll say it again.
Right.
And this was written mostly later, like in the exile. I think
it was compiled in the exile. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, there's a P and an H, and I was trying to figure out.
So I'll go through that in a moment. I want to get so before we hit that, any other initial thoughts of like what it's like to actually read through chunks of Leviticus?
They had a lot of rules.
Yeah, Larry?
And indeed, if these were all transferred from God to Moses, what is God's purpose in having all this detail? Is it so the people are more easily controlled, so they will be certain to follow the rules? If you make them complicated enough and tell them they've got to keep doing it every day or every week, which was another question. How often did you make a burnt offering? Was that done just on big celebrations, or was it a frequent sort of thing?
So we'll get to some of that, but what I'm hearing is like, what's the purpose of all of this? It's detailed why all the things and how often and all those questions. Leviticus will tell you, we didn't get there because I wasn't willing to do it. But Joanne, I also heard you chime in. What were you saying?
Well, gruesome. It's gruesome. I mean, the detail is,
So we'll also talk about some of why certain of the sacrifice practices are what they are. It might be surprising to us today, but we'll get there. Any other initial thoughts?
Well, I
Well,
noticed that the priests were almost like doctors.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That is actually a great observation.
Mhm.
Yeah, Sue, what were you gonna chime in?
I was going to say that they have different punishments for different crimes. And if it's a crime of a priest is different from a crime or an intentional crime or an unintentional crime, although we were mostly talking about unintentional crimes.
Mhm.
They're differentiating between the crimes, but as far as I could tell, the only difference in the sacrifice was the animal. It
Mhm.
was the same otherwise.
Mhm.
And this is really from this discussion of the tabernacle last week, which I missed. The notes in the bottom of the page on Leviticus says that when the world was created, God didn't know he was going to hang out with his people. So they had to build him a tabernacle to live in. So I guess that him living down on earth in a tabernacle is going to go on quite a while.
Yes.
Yes. It's pretty,
So,
uh, yeah.
oh, and here's Mary Ellen just in
Yeah.
time.
Yes.
Hello.
So,
Hey,
You are just in time. We were just discussing some initial opinions of Leviticus. I know you just sat down. Do you have anything off the top of your head?
no, I don't. I'm gonna be snacking though, because one of my running lates is I didn't finish my breakfast, so I'm just, excuse me,
go
well,
ahead. Enjoy.
No worries. All right. Well, with some of those initial thoughts, we'll hit all of those beats, but let's do a general overview of how, like, what is Leviticus? Why does it exist? And like, how is it structured? We're not going to be here long, so I didn't put like a full PowerPoint together for you like I've done previously. So let's just do a quick run of what to expect in this book, because I think knowing how to look at Leviticus actually helps more than knowing the law, the content itself. Knowing how it's used is much more useful, because Leviticus is one of those books, it is used and abused in arguments and debates, and it seems like one of the things that people pull out when they want to use a trump card of what God has to say. It's like, well, here's Leviticus, or people will use Leviticus to when someone else brings it out, someone brings out another one. It's one of those books that people don't get into depth about, but it's also sometimes people don't understand what and why it is. So to start off, let's actually think about the books that we just read, Genesis and Exodus. And with both of those, I told you about the four source theory, where we have a source from the Northern Kingdom and a source from the Southern Kingdom that we Frankenstein together. That's your J source and your E source. You have a little bit of a historian who like makes things make sense, which is the Deuteronomistic historian. And then you have the P source, which is your priestly source, that's all your lineages. That is all the times where just like the priests want to go in and insert a little bit of ritual and then they kind of pop out again. Leviticus is the priestly book. In the Hebrew name, it is actually called the Priest Manual. This book is not actually designed for laity to read. It is the handbook for the priests. It is kind of like our book of order. Theoretically, all of our elders and deacons know at least enough of the book of order to have like a working knowledge of what it says. Our church order is constructed around it. Our bylaws obey it. We do rules and we have certain things that go back to our book of order. But really, like, I'm not even overly well versed in the book of order. There are some people that like that is their thing. Our interim minister, Nita Nichols, she is one of those that like she knows the book of order well. And that's one of her specialties. And so if I have a question, I go to Nita to be like, help me out here. But that is kind of the way that the Leviticus is supposed to work. That by having it be a manual for the priests, it's one of those that if the priest have a question on how to do something, this is where they look. So does that change how we view Leviticus a little bit, instead of like a daily handbook to read, as more of a reference manual for the priests?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah, I think too, it helped me make sense of the medical aspects of things. They spend a lot of time talking about rashes, about, so they're talking about something that everybody can see.
Mhm.
I mean, you can see a rash. They're not talking about strokes, heart attacks, that sort of thing. They're talking about things that are going to be brought to the priest's attention because everybody can see it. And to them, everything's leprosy, of course, but that's all right.
The unfortunate thing is that we developed a disease that we actually call leprosy, when leprosy, I mean, is a catch-all term. We didn't read that section for today. I mean, you can. I wanted a dichotomous key for the skin rashes, because it's like, if this, then this, if this, then this. And you almost need a flow chart, but it's a reference manual. It's not,
Right.
it's to help people kind of sort things out. And Larry, I think you're spot on with there is a bit of medicalness to it. It's one of the fascinating things about Leviticus is we have separated out a lot of professions that were all grouped together. And yeah, priests were kind of medical people. Helen, did I see a hand?
Yes, and I noticed that if they were determined to have leprosy, that they were sent off to live by themselves. And I thought, what a terrible ultimatum to a person who was determined to have leprosy and have to live alone. I thought, well, I kind of knew that, but it kind of hit home when I read it in this.
So to hit on that one slightly, that why they were sent away is because it's literally, they understood that's, or like a lot of the dichotomous key of like, why they're like, is it a rash that's lasted for longer than 7 days? Is it a rash that's white? Is it a rash that's red? They're trying to see if it's contagious. They know that things like eczema exist. People would not be banished for psoriasis and eczema. That is kind of what some of those rules are trying to find out is this a chronic condition that is not going to transfer to other people? Or is this a rash that you are going to transfer if you touch it? And then it's contagion control. This is not even first century, this is ancient quarantine practices. And the one that's fascinating, I would have to Google to find out what verse it is. One of the things is for one of the issues is if this person shows this symptom, wear a cloth across the lower portion of your face. They literally tell the priest to cover their mouth and nose. They knew some things intuitively. Yeah, Larry?
Before streptomycin, after World War II, if you developed tuberculosis in the United States, you were put in a sanitarium.
Right.
You were confined there until you were pronounced cured, and you got no choice.
Before modern medicine, unfortunately, some of the things we humans had to do to contain illness is not pretty. And so some of this is literally in a world where you don't have modern medicine, you don't have very fine-tuned diagnostic tools. It's one of those that you have the health of the community put above the basically the well-being of the individual. If you can cure them, then you'll cure them. But if they're not curable, it is seen sacrificing one for the good of the many.
So with leprosy, that was not curable. So that was like forever that they left the group. And with tuberculosis, they had a chance of getting better and they could return to their families.
Yes.
I think the forever part of the leprosy is what would be
Oh, yes, you'd be much more likely to isolate a leper for forever than you would
Yeah.
somebody with TB.
Don't
Right.
they, some of their limbs drop off and
Well, yeah, you lose.
Once
digits.
again, I think it's very helpful. Do not think of modern leprosy when you see leprosy in the Bible. They're
Correct.
not really the same thing. Yes, leprosy did exist, and like the leprosy as we know it today was a factor.
Yeah.
But when they're talking about leprosy, 9 times out of 10, they're not talking about modern leprosy. This is one of those where a weird language example that is English is actually a good example of. So we know how to pickle a vegetable. We know that means like putting it in a brine, soaking it in vinegar, and it's going to preserve a vegetable. And many other cultures pickle many different things. But for some reason in English, when you refer to a pickle, you're referring to a pickled cucumber.
Mhm.
And so we have one specific thing that we call a pickle, but pickling is a process that you can do to many, many a thing. That's how leprosy kind of evolved. It was this general category that eventually scientifically became the equivalent of a pickled cucumber. So we think of modern leprosy, but it was a grab bucket of skin conditions. Eczema and psoriasis would have still been called leprosy.
Mhm.
So you wouldn't be banished for eczema, though. I'm just keeping that out there. You wouldn't necessarily be considered clean, but you wouldn't be banished.
Yeah, well, even today, almost any red, itchy, scaly rash in Europe is called eczema.
Mhm.
I mean, whereas here, it's a specific type of rash, whereas over there, it's a general term, if it's red, itchy, and scaly, it's eczema.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another funny one that I think in the modern world we kind of have a grab bag term. When you have an undiagnosable mystery gut issue, we just call it irritable bowel syndrome. And it's just a grab bag of issues. It's kind of like, at least in my experience, it's like, we don't fully know what's going on with you. You have IBS. And so like I said, they're trying to care for the community, but they don't have the very fine tools that we have today. But medical issues aside, let's put that one on the shelf. Let's return to kind of some of the things we have for our selections today. Going back to the overview, while the entire book of Exodus is kind of are associated with like the priests, it's called the priest manual, there are 2 large sections in it that kind of are put together and called the priest code, but have different tones, different focuses, and different kind of aims. And we'll get at the second part next week. But for today, all of our selections are in the priestly part of Leviticus. And Sue, you brought this up at the very beginning, that there's the P source and the H source. So the P source is very much concerned with like its main focus is purity. And the like worldview is, are the people's sin going to taint the tabernacle? Is basically by contact, if we don't do things correctly, will God be able to remain in this place with humans? Because they've built this very lavish tabernacle that I forgot who made the comments, like God wasn't planning on living on the earth with humans. Now the humans had to make a tabernacle so God would have a suitable dwelling. But if the people don't act right, it will become so tainted that God has to leave. And so a lot of these things are trying to live in such a way that God can remain with them. So this is, make sure the sacrifices are done right, because if the sacrifices aren't done right, the tabernacle will not remain as holy as they made it, and God's not going to get to stay. The holiness code, which is the second half of Leviticus, is less concerned with the holiness of the tabernacle itself, but looking at the holiness of the people.
Okay.
And so they're much more of like rules for good living rather than like ritual cleanliness. The first part is very much about the ritual. It's about the ritual cleanliness. The second part is looking at all of the people as holy and this moving camp as being holy. And so it is a much more dynamic. It's not trying to preserve the staticness of the holiness. And instead is like looking at what pollutes a people rather than what pollutes the tabernacle. It's like, I'm looking at my notes here. It's like the polluting effects of like incest or idolatry or depriving the people of Sabbaths. It's looking at more human to human holiness rather than human to God holiness. So those are the two big sections. The priest, can we be ritually holy versus the people, are we being good to each other holiness? Yeah,
So
Larry?
where would you put all those dietary restrictions?
Dietary, so that belongs in the first one. And dietary, once again, is actually more on the medical side of things. I included that just because it's fun to see some of the I think it's interesting to see the source of kosher rules, but there's medical reasons for all of them. And there's one in particular that I find just fascinating. But that belongs more in the priestly code of, like, this is the point where the priestly class is working like the CDC. They're like, hey, or the Food and Drug Administration, hey, let's not eat this thing because it looks like it's killing people. And if you're living with God and someone drops dead because they ate something, it kind of looks like God smited them. Just gonna put it out there. And so they associate some health things with God's judgment. And that's another way to think about it, is some of this is literally just trying to be the best possible. And if someone drops dead after doing something their entire life, and it's like, well, I guess God didn't like that. God chose to kill that person after they ate some rabbit. So,
or lobster or oyster. I mean,
right.
Anything that doesn't have a fin and a tail.
yeah, right. If it's not a fish, you can't eat it.
Right. So that said, does that kind of give us a way to look at Leviticus that's less of like a wall of rules and more like a book of guidelines for a good life? Because that's the other thing that is the biggest misconception, I think, in how people look at Leviticus. They look at this through the like very American litigious society, that if you break a law, you're gonna, if you slander someone, you can get sued. If you break a law, you're going to get punished. This is not that kind of code. There are punishments for certain actions, but a lot of this is not considered a very litigious book. It is a book of guidelines for a good life. Tell us how to relate well with each other. Let's set up boundaries so we can get along. Let's settle the dispute between neighbors so they can remain neighbors. It's more about reconciling. It's about living together well.
That sometimes you were only being, or you were only like sitting in the corner until till sunset.
Yeah. Oh,
If
yeah.
by sunset you were forgiven. I
Mhm.
just thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump into some of these offerings. I know they were repetitive, but I think it does give us an interesting kind of just look into the cultic practices. So,
I have to leave.
okay, take care, Helen.
Bye-bye.
With the offerings, so we have burnt offerings of animals, we have burnt offerings of grain, we have other, let's see, what else? Offerings for well-being and sin offerings. So this is literally, I wasn't intending to make you read these like with a fine-tooth comb, because yes, the second part, or the chunk, this is a repetitive chunk. But let's talk about why it's repetitive. So the first one it talks about is the burnt offering of the herd. Then it specifies bulls. Then it specifies sheep and goats. And then it specifies birds. And like it says, if this and then this. And this after each one of those different types of burnt offerings, it says this basically the same thing. The birds is a little bit different because their bodies are smaller. But why would you have the same, like a different animal, but the same chunk underneath? There is a reason, and I'm curious if you all have any thoughts of why they would frame it that way.
You mean the way they cut it up and get rid of this part and that part, or what?
Not quite yet, but why is it that they name an animal and then say the same darn thing each time? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
I had always understood that the Jewish people did not eat the lobster, shrimp, crab, etc., because they were bottom dwellers and scavengers. And the birds that are mentioned here are raptors, and they will eat carrion, and they will eat all sorts of undesirable things. And I'm just wondering if there's any connection between the two.
Yes. Can we put a pin in that thought and get to it in a moment, though? We'll talk about some of the dietary stuff in a moment. I'm still back at the first 4 chapters talking about burnt offerings.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, no worries. It's a good, you're on to something is the thing. I just want to be able to talk about it in depth. Larry, what were you saying?
But when they talk about the herd, aren't they referring mainly to cattle and to, domesticated oxen, donkeys, horses, that sort of thing. And then the others are sheep and that run in, and so forth, that run in flocks. But they're treated the same, all pretty much, if they're offered as a burnt offering. But I couldn't get at why the distinction.
So this comes from people asking questions. So if you're going to sacrifice an animal, here's the way to do it. It should be a male without blemish. And these are the parts you burn, and this is God's part, right? And then can you imagine the guy in the back going, what about if I sacrifice a bull? And then the person going, okay, if you sacrifice a bull, it needs to be a male without blemish, and this is the part you take out, and this is the part you burn, okay? And then you hear another guy in back raise his hand. But what if I only have sheep? And it's like, okay, if you have a sheep, this is how you do it. And it's to make sure that it is as clear as can be, because people had different kinds of animals. Typically, you didn't have all the animals, and they want to make very clear that each animal is treated in specific ways. And so the first Leviticus 1 verse 3 kind of is supposed to cover all of them. But then when they repeat it, it's like, okay, different, here's a specific animal, but I'm going to tell you it's treated the same way, okay? Here's another animal. And if they leave out a bit, there may be a loophole. But because they need to get the sacrifices correctly to make sure that the tabernacle is holy, they repeat the instructions just in case you missed it. But if you also see it as like a reference manual and you're skimming and you're just like, okay, I need to find, where does it talk about the bull? Where does it talk about the bull? Where does it talk about the bull? Oh, here we go. Here's the one about the bull. You may have just skimmed across the general instructions, so they repeat it again, because humans don't read signs. And so that could be another way that you could see this, is some of the repetition is because it's a manual. And if you're spot reading it, if you're not reading it from cover to cover, but you're just like, what does it say about birds? They're going to repeat all the they're going to repeat all the things again. So once again, this is why it's better to know how Leviticus works. So the repetition is to make sure that people get all the instructions, no matter if you're reading it cover to cover, or if you're just reading the section that you need because someone just brought in an animal and you forgot what to do with it. So let's talk about what actually gets burnt, what gets saved, and what happens. Because we talked about this a little bit before when setting up the tabernacle. So some parts are burnt, some parts are set aside, some parts are burnt away, some parts are God, and some parts are not. So we have specific body parts taken out and burnt and turned into smoke. Anything that's turned into smoke is God's portion of the sacrifice. Basically, assume that like God is basically eating the smoke or consuming the smoke. God is enjoying the smoke. The smoke is what God interacts with. So anything turned to smoke is for God's sake. So do you all see the, or I'm kind of looking at a wall of text. I remember like kidneys and liver, and there's a few other things that were always turned to smoke. Did you all spot that?
Yeah, the weird stuff. They also said there's something about fat. You're supposed to drain all the fat out, and all the blood. But the fat human beings are never supposed to eat fat. I think it said. I don't know why that was.
The fat is God's portion of the meal.
Okay. Okay.
It's also, if you're slow, this is me being a slightly cynical. If you're slow roasting something over a fire, what drips off the meat?
Fat.
The fat.
Yeah.
So how you share a cheap piece of meat is you slow roast it. The fat's God's part and the meat is your part.
And they say God enjoys the smell too. He likes the odor of
it. Does smell better.
Yeah. So some of this is just practical. When you slow roast something, the fat's going to leach out of it. Fat also burns well, so it's going to sustain the fire. So it, like, if you can imagine in an ancient mindset, you have a piece of meat that's turning over a fire, the fat's dripping off of it, and every time that fat hits the fire, there's a happy flame. That looks like there is something enjoying the fat as it drips off the meat. Once again, I think this is me taking a guess. I actually don't know this. My assumption of why the entrails, the liver, and the kidneys are burnt and humans are told not to consume them is simply because most people don't like those.
Yeah. Well, and a health reason too. It may be health. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact that turning stuff into smoke, doesn't that sort of reinforce the idea that God must be up there somewhere in the ether where the smoke is rising?
Yeah. The smoke rises to heaven and God's up there and it dissipates, so evidently God's consuming it.
That's right.
So what are the health reasons for not eating kidney? Most people don't like them, but I used to eat kidneys, and my mother used to make them, and they have steak and kidney pie. I wouldn't eat them now for some reason. It seems kind of icky, but what are the health reasons for not eating, besides the fact that's where they filter out bad stuff?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the Israelites realize that. But if you ever smelled a kidney boiling,
yes, it's
my
bad.
mother used to boil them up for her cats, and because they loved boiled kidney. But the smell, it smells like urine, stale urine. It's not a pleasant odor.
Smells pretty bad. Okay.
Yeah, the one I actually found interesting is that the liver is taken out, because I feel like liver is still one of those that, I mean, it's still not like today, it has an even worse reputation, but people did eat it. But I think once again, there's a point where if you have an abundant society, if you're living in abundance, then theoretically you could eat the choice meat and not the things you don't want to.
Mhm.
And the idea is setting up a society where you trust that God is going to provide enough. And if God provides enough, you don't have to eat, my brain just said depression era food. Like my grandfather refused to eat peanut butter because he considered it poverty food and he just had enough of it growing up. And so they're setting up a society where hopefully there is enough that you don't, entrails, that's actually gross. Like health-wise, don't eat entrails. But you also don't have to eat the kidneys and the liver because we're going to have an abundant society where you don't have to eat like that kind of food.
We ate liver when I was growing up to get enough iron.
All
Mhm.
right.
Yeah, we had it once a week.
Yeah, it was the treatment for pernicious anemia too.
Oh,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep. So, Joanne, I think you mentioned that this is kind of some of the practices on how to sacrifice these animals are fairly brutal.
I also, I found it very interesting, the bull. I can imagine bringing a bull into this area and trying to contain it, touch its head and kill it. I mean, that could be a wild thing. A bull is not a gentle animal like a cow. A bull, I mean, I can imagine all kinds of chaos going on and people scattering all over before that bull got killed.
Oh,
Mhm.
then the priest is gonna sling the blood all over the altar.
So the thing to consider is, and this is true with both kosher practices and halal practices, which is the Islamic faith also has a very specific dietary code. And why meats get classified as halal or kosher, there we go, is because there's specific ways that are considered humane ways to kill an animal. So part of the instructions for the priest is actually how to do it. And this is the ancient way of how to do it with the least amount of pain to the animal in a way that is healthy. So blood can there's a lot of bloodborne illnesses. And so they're like, don't, or there are specific ways to like slaughter an animal so the blood doesn't get places where you don't want it to be. It gets thrown on the altar, but it's not thrown on the animal. Don't contaminate it with blood, don't eat blood. And then also like the way to kill the birds, it's literally wring its neck is considered like that's the fastest way to kill a bird. And so all of this is actually an attempt to be humane. It seems brutal today because we have different understandings of things. We have different ways to kill animals that are considered like immediate death so they don't experience pain. So this is both health and being humane. So some of these practices are still used today because it is still seen as the most, in their view, it's seen as the most humane way to kill animals as told by God. So that's why some of these things are still done today. It's actually out of kind care for the animals. Yeah, Larry?
Jehovah's Witnesses still won't take blood transfusions. Is that related to that, or is it more related to Jesus' death on the cross and the blood? You know?
I learned this at one point in an ethics class, and I cannot give you a surefire answer. I would say Google that one. I don't think it deals with dietary. I think it deals more with life force. But there certain sects of more like Hasidic Judaism also has elements of this. So there is an argument. I just don't know what it is specifically.
Okay. They don't celebrate birthdays either, so.
Yeah.
Or
So,
Chris-
so we have a lot of burnt offerings. There's a grain offering with, once again, it is talking about the ins and the outs of how to give grain offerings. There's different kinds of grain offerings for different things. All of this is going into detail because when it goes farther into the text, it will cross-reference itself. It's like, if you do this, then you need to do this kind of sacrifice and with this kind of thing. And then you can flip back and forth like a user's manual. So there's times where my assumption at least is if you're just an average person, you can go to the priest, say, hey, I want to do this thing. How do I do it? And then bring out the text and then be scrolling, because these would have been on more probably scrolls. They would scroll to the different sections and they would tell you what you need to know. Didn't have to be memorized. If this is a user's manual, once again, why all the instructions are repeated all over the place. If you're like, hey, I want to do a grain offering, the priest can go, okay, no leavening in the bread. Leavening and honey are like, we don't want those in the bread. The grain offering needs to be, and that's because it relates to the Exodus, and that's just the tradition, no leavening in the offerings. But then if you want to give a griddle cake, if you want to do baked flour, if you want to give raw flour, here are the instructions on how to do it. So you could go and ask questions. We have offerings of well-being and sin offerings. Sin offerings goes into depth, but you can read that. I would rather flip over and talk about the dietary stuff because I know that's interesting and people have questions. So before we get to the dietary stuff, any questions of kind of how this section of Leviticus is working, kind of reference manual offerings, helping out the priests? All right. The last thing that I'll say that I was reading about in the introduction is that priests were not like these high untouchable officials. We know from other places in scripture that priests, there was like battlefield chaplains. We see priests going into like common areas. Priests, I think we associate it with a very high office. I like think about it more like the pastors that you know. Like there's the ones that know the rules really well. There's the high people that like do the control, like a lot of rules and like making sure everything's going according to plan. And then there's your on the ground priests that are helping out with day-to-day stuff. So some of the priests are, you have to make sure all the priests are taken care of, but it's not just Aaron and his sons and they're like high and official and like you can't touch them. There was common priests too. Hence why you need a user's manual. But let's jump over to the food, which is in chapter 11, clean and unclean food. And this once again is very much a health code. So Mary Ellen, the question that you asked is you related the birds that you can and can't eat with the fish you can and cannot eat. So your intuition, I would say, is spot on, because a lot of what are considered unclean foods are foods that, if not cooked properly, carry illness. I think pigs are one that like we're very familiar with, that if you do not cook pork thoroughly, it is known to get people sick. This is true for a lot of the other animals they're talking about. So why not eat shellfish? Shellfish can get like is known to get people sick if you don't cook it all the way or cook it perfectly. And with the birds, don't eat birds that are predators to other birds is basically what they're saying. A lot of these, don't eat scavengers, don't eat birds of prey. Partly, if you kill hawks, mouse populations go up, so don't eat hawks. Don't eat buzzards because buzzards eat roadkill. And so a lot of this is both either how to maintain an ecosystem. Don't take your predators. I know you're hungry. Don't take the predators away or you're going to have a rodent problem. Or don't eat this bird because this bird likely carries illness because it eats nasty things.
Okay, and the nasty things are mostly animals rather than seeds and grain and things like that. Okay.
Right. So most of the birds that they're saying are on the don't eat list are all birds, predatory birds, whether they are hawks, eagles, or like buzzards, vultures. Those are just the local animals that preyed on other animals. So don't eat predator birds. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, they also ate carrion, which has to be disease carrying as well. You know, if they I've seen it on videos where they circle a dying animal. And, just waiting for it to die, and then they descend and have a feast. But they'll also eat animals that have died days ago, and that stuff has to be nasty, 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 disease-bearing, whatever. So it makes common sense to me not to eat them.
Yeah. Yeah, Larry?
To me, I can see a lot of sense in the observation. Don't do away with the vultures, or you're going to be living in a mess of rotting other animals. They serve a very useful purpose, so you don't eat those. But what did an oyster ever do from anybody? I mean, maybe somebody got sick from eating oysters, but there's a lot of foodborne illness that is not specifically related to the food itself, but rather to the bacteria or virus or whatever that contaminates it. And I still eat my oysters raw.
So yes. So a lot of I'm thinking back to one of my professors, and there's partially an ick factor.
Yeah.
I honestly think some of this is actually just cultural. So I will be honest, I grew up in Kansas. I did not grow up eating seafood. I am more than happy to eat seafood, but I won't do it often because I never developed the palate. I will be honest. I've learned to like certain things, but I'm sorry, Larry, I'm not going to eat an oyster.
I know.
I've tried it. It's just not my cup of tea. And it's because I grew up in the middle of the country, which seafood was not reliable.
Yes, that's true.
Don't eat seafood in Kansas. It's a bad idea.
Yeah. That's the other thing that we should take into consideration. The Israelis didn't at that time have any refrigeration. They had no way to preserve fresh seafood, which could have gone bad very quickly.
So
And
the people.
Gross. Excuse me.
No, yes, that is 100%. They don't have refrigeration. If they want to preserve something, you cover it in salt. And what salts really well? Fish with fins. So you have a group of people wandering around the desert in a landlocked thing. They're eventually going to go to an area that is close to the sea. And so some of this may just be like, ew, why are you eating that slug in a shell? Like, what? And that's why I say there may be an ick factor of just humans being humans. Some of it is illness. Literally, how do you preserve an oyster? I don't know. I eat them fresh. If you're not in an area where you can eat oysters fresh, are you going to? Probably not. And then what food can you preserve well? What food can you preserve safely?
Meat.
But then you have some of the weird ones. So I love how there is like a rule and then an explanation of what doesn't fit the rule. So one of the famous ones is you can eat animals with a cloven hoof that chew the cud.
Yeah.
And then it tells you what doesn't count. So a pig has a cloven hoof, kind of. It doesn't technically by science, but it has like 2 toes. But it doesn't chew the cud, which is why pigs are out. Rabbits chew the cud, but don't have a hoof, so you don't eat a rabbit or a hare. Now, here's one that I find fascinating, and this is not in biblical research. This is articles that I've read other places where they have found people in more of the fur trapper times in colonial America, They would go and they would find a cabin of fur trappers that were eating rabbits and hares who died of starvation. And the question is, what happened there? And modern science has tested this, and it turns out rabbits and hares are so lean that it sucks all the vitamin A out of your system. It basically takes more nutrients to digest them than they give you. And so they're nutrient negative. And so they found people eating rabbit that starved to death.
Oh,
I'm amazed that we don't have a rabbit diet.
Well, it's just,
Everybody
it's
eat
not good for
rabbit
you.
and stay thin.
So
I
you
would-
can see why someone would look like they're smited by God for eating rabbits, only rabbits, if if you see someone constantly eating and starving at the same time, that looks like divine intervention.
That's excellent.
So there's some of these that we can we look now and we're like, oh, wow, they said this was a God rule, but actually just turns out to be smart. But that's only true if you eat a diet of only rabbit, evidently. If you have it every once in a while, you'll be fine.
I didn't realize rabbits chew the cud.
They don't, but
Yeah,
it looks like they do. They
Yeah,
they
that's
chew
right.
enough that it looks like they chew a cud. They don't actually. This is why
Yeah.
it's kind of funny.
Yeah, yes, really funny.
So, like, fish need fins, like gills and fins. So one of the things that is not on the okay to eat list is shark. But also, if I remember reading about this in a book where there's a plane crash and survival, there's actually very little shark meat that is actually ingestible by humans. Like, you can't eat there are certain kinds of shark where it's not good for us to eat them. So once again, don't eat sharks because they have gills, but they don't look like they have scales and fins.
Yeah.
Don't eat the bug creatures in the water because ew, why would you eat a lobster? That's gross. But also don't eat catfish because catfish are bottom feeders that feed on other things. Once again, ew, dirty. However, this is also where it gets interesting. Archaeologists have gone back to ancient Israel and like gone in the layer where like they would have been theoretically following Jewish dietary laws in the 1st century. And what they found is they ate catfish all the time. They ate shellfish. Common people did not follow these rules to the T. Which, once again, I reiterate, these were reference manuals for priests. It turns out people in small towns are going to eat what they're going to eat. There's actual evidence that some of these small Jewish towns may have also eaten pork because pork was common in the area. So it's either they were ignorant of the laws or they just didn't care, or they were considered just the guidelines for the priest who had to go into the temple, and common people didn't have to obey by all of them. Obey by the ones that were smart, but if you're hungry, if you're starving, you're gonna eat roasted pork rather than starve to death, most likely. Mary Ellen, yeah?
Well, the ones that were living on the shoreline and eating the shellfish were probably not able to get beef or lamb. I mean, these are herds. And, you ate what was in your area. And, the pigs would be, to me, one of the first things that they could put in a pen, keep in a place, feed with their cast-offs. And it kind of was the bridge between the fish and the meat market. But I'm just guessing that both were not available in the same place, and they ate what they had. And probably didn't have a local priest to tell them not to.
Yeah.
Yeah, Larry?
And I think there is little or no evidence to show that any specific food is going to really harm somebody. something may be wrong with it. But look at what we can eat now. You can eat kidney, you can eat liver, you can eat brain if you want to, some people do. If you look at scavenging animals like lions and tigers and cougars, when they take down an animal, what's the first thing they do? They rip it open and they eat the entrails. Once they're done with that, then they start gnawing away at the meat, whereas we'd go at it in exactly the opposite way.
Right. So this is where this book gets to be very culturally minded, is the whole biblical trajectory started with nomadic herds people. And while they move about and they enter new areas, they develop other cultures, I think it's essential to remember this whole tradition centers around nomadic herds people, and they never forget that. Which is why Genesis is very important to understand the trajectory. These are still nomadic herds people, even when they settle a country. They branch out and they expand and they integrate into society, but then they have to contend with these other cultures. And so one thing that you bring to mind, Larry, is we have kind of studied both culture and science together, and we can figure out why it's okay to eat sushi. And like a lot of people, when they first hear about sushi, they're like, ew, you're eating raw fish? That's gross. And that's where I say human ick factor. But what we find is there's a way to do it that is safe and healthy. And most cultures figure out a way to eat the foods they traditionally eat in safe and healthy ways. But when a group goes from one area into another area, they may not have that knowledge. This is a group of sheep and goat herders. They don't know how to serve pig correctly. And they're told not to interact with the locals because they're pagan heathens. Don't intermarry with them. So they're not developing the cultural knowledge on how to eat pigs safely. Enough people were doing it in the ancient world that they had developed ways to do it safely. But there's almost a way that they're not willing to learn. They're not willing to learn how to eat shellfish safely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Larry?
I think a great example nowadays is what the Japanese, what I think it's called a fugu fish or something or other. It has a gland in it which is poisonous. And whoever prepares the fish must be an expert in excising that gland. Otherwise, there's a possibility the person that eats it could die. It's killed people.
What fish has that?
It's some sort of special Japanese fish. I think it
Oh,
was fugu or some, it sounds, it has a very Japanese sounding name.
okay, I'll stay away from that.
So, let's see. Oh, we're at time. So I'm curious what you're thinking about kind of after kind of dealing with some of these dietary laws. We didn't get to all the unclean animals. Basically, once again, don't eat a carcass. Like if you're gonna eat an animal, you kill it fresh, which is just a good idea. Don't eat roadkill. But there's other animals that it's like, don't eat them. And either they're considered like disease vectors, like mice. Don't eat mice. Probably a good idea. But there's also other ones that it's just probably a bad idea to try to eat a crocodile because it's probably not a good idea to try to kill a crocodile. And so some of these make intuitive sense.
Like a camel, they have to ride the camels.
Right. Not a good idea to eat the thing, not a good idea to eat your main mode of transportation. So,
but they do in the Middle East now. They eat camels.
They
all
do?
right. Mary Ellen?
Well, I'm finding it interesting that this whole progression of the dietary laws has progressed beyond a nomadic tribe traveling through the Sinai, that they're talking about crocodiles. Well, that's much further down their journey. they're talking about seafood. Well, they've got a long ways to go before they get to an ocean where they can, even be tempted by seafood. A lot of, like pigs are not herding animals, so I don't see them having pigs to worry about while they're on this journey. So a lot of this to me is further down the road of this story, not now.
Yes, 100%. They put it in here because there is some ways that it makes sense to have the guidebook for the priest to follow after Exodus, because Exodus kind of is your mini manual. Here's your big manual. It makes sense to slot it in. But you're right. This book is written for people who probably are not nomadic. This is probably the form that we get today, probably got carried with them from the temple itself into exile. And that's the one, or like the memory of it got carried into exile and then compiled up there. But your intuition is also spot on here to say this is probably written in a way for people not in the tabernacle but in the temple, and it comes through with some of these things that are like very anachronistic for the place in the story where we see it.
Mhm.
Some of the things, though, I do find interesting between the ostriches and the crocodiles. Those are actually Egyptian animals.
Mhm.
Like they're not in the Levant. They're in Africa. So there does seem to be some wider cultural knowledge that is being preserved either from travels, from experience, or there's something. If you go to Egypt, don't eat ostrich. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and some of that was a carryover from when they were enslaved in Egypt. I mean, they had ample opportunity then to be exposed to some of these more exotic things.
Yeah. So one of the last things that I'll kind of tie a bow around this for today. So the sacrifice laws and the dietary laws are some of the things we throw out first in Leviticus, because the temple does not exist anymore. The Jewish people do not do sacrifices, because the temple hasn't existed since the year 70 CE, where Rome demolished it. It does not exist. The dietary laws are held onto in the Jewish community because that is something that is portable, and it's a way to connect with culture. But after Jesus did his whole ministry thing, ascended to heaven, and all of a sudden the Jesus fan club is recruiting new members, the question becomes, what do we do with these dietary laws? Because that is cultural. That's one of the ways that they could have cultural connection to the people where they came from. And it's one of the first things that the community says of like, hey, people want to join the Jesus fan club. Do they have to eat like we do? Which in some ways is such a practical question. It is a question that people who have intercultural marriages have to ask. It's like, what kind of food are we going to eat at home? It's when you have like family gatherings of people from different places, it's like, what food do you bring to the potluck? It's a practical question. It's a cultural question. And the question was, is Christianity going to be bound by Jewish culture, or what's going to be the guiding principle? And the decision was eventually, the one rule you have to follow is don't eat blood.
Don't eat blood.
Don't eat
Okay.
blood. That's the decision that like Paul and Peter come to, is don't eat blood. And then the
Right.
rest of it, I think, is cultural. And they let up on the dietary laws.
The blood is that's why when they kill the animal, they drain the blood out and you buy, okay.
Yeah. So it's that these rules do, while like today we don't pay attention to them, when we're looking at scripture, it does play a role. There's other ones with bread offerings that relate to Jesus, one of Jesus's stories, but that's for another day. So, but that's why I kind of wanted to give you all a taste of Leviticus to both see kind of the format of it, but also a few of these do have long-ranging effects. So next week, I believe I have you all reading chapter 16, which is the start of the Holiness Code, which is the second section of Leviticus. So that's more of, it's the Day of Atonement, but this is one where all of a sudden you're not dealing with, are we polluting God's kingdom? It's more like, how do we relate to each other? So that will be for next week, and then we're done with Leviticus. I'm only doing 2 weeks of it, and then we
Okay.
get to the next book.
Chapter 16, is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
It also has, this one begins the Holiness Code, but it also connects to Christian theology and how we understand Christian theology. So
Okay.
You also said 4 for next week, chapter 4, 1 through 35.
oh, that's what we just talked about with the food. Wait, chapter 4. Oh, did I?
Yeah.
Food was 11, wasn't it?
So actually, that's actually not a bad idea. That didn't get transferred over. Chapter 4 deals with sin offerings, which is gonna connect to chapter 16. So 16 is the one to focus on. It will reference some sacrifices, and the sacrifices are back in chapter 4. So the two can go side by side.
So read them both, huh?
Skim chapter 4. You don't have to read it in depth, but
Oh, okay.
all right, folks. Well, shall I pray us out for today?
Sure.
All right, let us pray. Gracious and loving God, in reading Leviticus, we're reminded that the people structured their lives to make sure that your presence could remain with them, that that you could be amongst them, because they were hungry to be with you. And God, we have that same hunger today. We understand it differently, but God, we still want you in our lives. And we are doing our best to structure it in a way that we can feel your presence, that we can live out what we understand you're telling us to do today, because we want to hold on to that connection to you, the connection to our Creator, the connection to the one who gives us life, the one who tells us that we are loved and we belong. So help guide us in that pursuit to be the best we can be, and so that we can feel your presence every day of our lives. So be with this group, be with everyone who's traveling on the roads today as they are slick and icy, and just be with us all until we gather again together. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank
Yeah, thank you
you.
all. Have a good rest of the day.
See ya.
Bye.